Everybody. My name is Dr. Rebecca Kellum. There I am. And I am Assistant Professor of Pediatrics here at Bay Path University and also a public school pediatric OT. So I'm very excited about tonight for multiple reasons, but one, we're going to talk tonight about a hot topic, untangling the sensory knot, clarifying theory, practice, and decision making in school practice. And we are honored to have Dr. Joyce Rioux as our guest speaker. Dr. Rioux brings over 40 years of experience in school-based occupational therapy. She's a CREC consultant, co-chair of Canoda's Government Affairs Committee, and a leader in state and national initiatives, including Connecticut's 2025 School OT Guidelines and AOTA Schools Practice Briefing paper. She is also a co-editor and contributor to key publications on best practices in school and early childhood OT. In addition, she's personally my mentor, who I could never thank enough for what she's contributed to school-based practice and occupational therapy in general. So before we begin, I'd like to briefly orient everyone to Zoom. If you move your cursor on the screen, you'll see a view option in the top right corner. Please select presenter view rather than gallery view so you can view the slides alongside the speaker's video for your best viewing experience. Throughout the presentation, feel free to submit your questions in the chat, and I'll have time, and Joyce will have time at the end to go through those questions and answer them. So please welcome Dr. Joyce Rioux. I am going to flip the slides and share her slides for you. One moment.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I appreciate having the opportunity to come here today and talk about this topic. It has been a very hot topic in school practice, so it'll be fun to kind of untangle all of this. Technology is always a little
I know
slower,
it's like a little screen, so I'm trying. Do you see it right now? Untangling the sensory
we
knot.
we do. That's
Oh,
perfect.
fantastic.
So you can just jump right to the next page then. So for everyone here today, if you've been following recent articles in our field, you may have noticed a bit of a debate heating up around Ayres Sensory Integration or ASI in schools. So I just want to quickly ground everyone with what has been going on. One article, this February article in 2025, actually calls for more use of Ayres sensory integration in school practice. And then we have an article in May and June 2025 edition of AJOT that pushes back against that, arguing that ASI as a specific intervention doesn't really fit within the educational model. And then this third article, which is the rebuttal to that pushback, saying, hey, wait a minute, we may be misunderstanding ASI, and makes the case that it can belong in schools. So it's not just disagreement, it's very layered. At the center of this tension are two very different ways of thinking about our role in school practice. On one side, you have an ASI focused perspective, and this view leans into neuroscience, things like sensory processing, motor planning, helping the nervous system support more adaptive responses. And on the other side, you have a participation focused perspective. And this view asks, are we staying anchored in what schools are actually about, helping students access, engage, and succeed in their daily classroom routines? And here's where it gets tricky, especially if you're newer to this. We start using terms like ASI, sensory integration, and sensory processing like they all mean the same thing when they actually don't. Sometimes we're talking about a theory, sometimes we're talking about an intervention, and sometimes just a lens for understanding behavior. And when those all get blurred, so does our decision making. So the real question isn't, which side is right. It really is this. How do we use our sensory expertise in a way that really clearly supports a student's success in school? So today isn't about choosing a camp. It's about stepping back and taking that balcony view so we can see what each perspective is offering and where we go from there. Next slide. Thanks. So before we jump in, I want to be upfront about where I'm coming from. Rebecca already shared that I am, deeply rooted in school practice. I've been a school occupational therapist for many years, and I've also bring lived experience from working in an administrative role in schools. So both of these perspectives have shaped how I understand daily school practice, the realities, the constraints, and just that constant balancing that happens in schools. This session, again, is not about proving one approach is right or wrong. It's really about stepping back, getting curious, and thinking together about how sensory approaches actually fit within our school context. And, I'll name it. I do have a bias. The school occupation first lens is going to show up. At the same time, I strongly believe we need to make space for different perspectives. When we don't, that is when our profession starts to divide instead of come together. Because I value our mission in schools so deeply, I have to be intentional about not dismissing the foundational neuroscientific concerns that come from the Ayres sensory integration perspective. I need to be very deliberate in that. I also want everyone here to reflect on your own lens. We all bring experiences, training, and beliefs that shape how we interpret what we see and what we do. And being aware of it isn't a weakness. It's actually what strengthens our professional reasoning. So as we go through today, I really want people to feel like this is a space where you can think out loud, question ideas, and even disagree a bit. That's how we grow. The goal here is understanding, not winning. As you're listening, just keep a few questions in the back of your mind. What's really driving your practice? What counts as evidence for you? And how do you explain what you do to a teacher or a parent? So we're going to start off with that bigger balcony view and then bring it down into what we need to think about in practice. Next slide. So I'm sure all of you have been faced with conflict at some time. A meeting gets tense, a parent wants more, a teacher feels overwhelmed, and suddenly you're just in the middle of competing perspectives. Your heart begins to race, and you're just on that dance floor, reacting to the moment instead of really focusing in on the student. But there's a different way to lead, and that is the balcony view. The balcony view was developed by William Ury. Just requires a simple mental shift to step off of the dance floor and observe from above. From the balcony, you're not defending a position, you're actually able to see the whole system. You notice patterns, perspectives, and more importantly, shared goals. And this matters because in these moments, we're often looking at two groups trying to solve the same problem, which really is all about student participation. One perspective focuses in on the access gap. If a student isn't regulated, then they can't access learning. The other focuses on instructional impact. If we pull students out, they miss learning opportunities. Both are valid. The balcony view helps us hold both so we can move forward with clarity, collaboration, and a shared focus on student success. Next slide. So the first step in taking the balcony view is simple. What problem is each side actually trying to solve? When we look at I'm going to call it the pro ASI perspective, the concern is access. If a student is struggling with sensory processing or sensory integration, they may not be able to fully engage. So the focus becomes, so the focus really looks at reducing those participation barriers, closing that access gap, and making sure we're addressing equity. On the other side, and I'm going to call this the occupation-centered perspective, is thinking about time and impact. How do we build functional skills within the school day? How do we avoid pulling students out of instruction? And how do we make sure what we're doing directly supports meaningful outcomes? So again, it's not different goals, it's different ways of getting to the same goal, which is student participation. Next slide. Now we're going to look at, oh, back up one. Yep, perfect, thank you. We're going to look at the assumptions that drive each perspective. This is the next step in the balcony view. So from a pro-ASI perspective, the focus is traditionally bottom up. We see sensory as limiting, meaning participation is restricted when underlying sensory integration challenges aren't addressed. This leads to foundational change, improving those underlying skills, supports that broader classroom engagement. And it's guided by an evidence imperative, relying on research-informed approaches to sensory integration. From an occupation-centered perspective, the focus is top-down. We see occupation as driving. Competence comes from meaningful, activity-specific experiences. This emphasizes a contextual change. Skills grow best when we shape the environment to support participation. And finally, it relies on embedded learning, interventions built into classroom routines to support engagement and generalization. So understanding these assumptions helps us see why each approach emphasizes different strategies. Next slide. The next step is to really think about what motivates each perspective. So here we are on the pro-ASI side. It's about equity and long-term participation, making sure students have fair access to supports, focusing on student-centered outcomes, skills that matter in daily school tasks, and addressing those underlying sensory challenges to support lasting engagement. From the occupation-centered side, the focus shifts a bit, protecting instructional time while still supporting engagement and upholding professional integrity by using evidence-based approaches. Also targeting interventions efficiently to directly impact classroom performance. Both sides want the same thing, students participating and succeeding, but they're motivated by slightly different priorities. Seeing these motivations clearly is what lets us understand the why behind each approach and opens the door to really finding the common ground. Next slide. Few more steps to go, everybody. Here we are, let's just talk about how to represent each perspective fairly. For the pro-ASI side, the focus is on individualized, playful interventions that build foundational skills and support engagement. The goal is to increase participation across settings. And collaboration matters in an ASI model. They plan goals with the student, with the family, with the school team. You'll see some parallels in the occupation-centered perspective as well. Collaboration is also key in occupation-centered practice. We are partnering with a team to focus on participation-centered outcomes. We're also engaged, or the occupation center perspective. The focus is on embedding interventions in the context where students need them most, which is in the classroom. And this approach ensures students apply skills in real life settings, reinforcing their participation and identity as learners. So again, both approaches want the same thing, students actively participating and succeeding, yet they highlight different ways of making a meaningful impact. Representing each fairly means honoring both the strategy and the intention behind it. Next one. All right, so where do we overlap? Now that we've laid out each perspective fairly, or hopefully I did it fairly, the next step in our balcony view is to look for connections. Where do they overlap? The first and biggest overlap is the shared goal. Both perspectives want to maximize student participation and engagement. Next, both care about the students' well-being, helping kids feel confident, reducing frustration, and creating a positive experience at school. And finally, both aim to build competence, developing skills that foster independence and success in school. Even though the paths may look different, the destination is the same. Students who are engaged, confident, and capable. So seeing those connections is what allows us to bridge perspectives instead of choosing sides. Next slide. So what becomes possible if we stop choosing sides? When we focus on underlying needs rather than positions, we open the door to creative solutions that meet everyone's needs. By listening carefully, understanding the needs of students, teachers, and families, and thinking flexibly, we can begin to design strategies that truly work without compromise that leaves anyone unsatisfied. We can create a hybrid approach, combining sensory informed strategies grounded in theory with meaningful real world classroom participation. We can embrace student-centered collaboration, bringing the student, teachers, the staff, the families, all into planning and implementing strategies together. We could use coaching and modeling, helping teachers and other key adults reinforce strategies naturally throughout the day. We can engage in reflective team decision-making, adjusting strategies based on ongoing observation and the students' feedback. And we can practice contextual flexibility, adapting strategies across settings and activities while keeping participation at the center. So if we stop choosing sides, we can move from debate to action and from theory to real impact in the classroom. Next slide. All right, so finally, let's ground this in reality. What helps us move from sides to possibilities? First, professional reasoning. Being able to use theory, evidence, and professional insight to guide our decisions that truly support student participation. Next is resources, making the most of shared time, space, tools, and staff to deliver effective strategies. We also need to consider systems and law, aligning our work with education laws, inclusion mandates, MTSS frameworks, all of that. And above all, collaborative unity, partnering with teachers, administrators, support staff, families, and the student to ensure consistent, meaningful impact. And when we begin to anchor in these supports, we can translate what we've learned from that balcony view into real change for students, finding solutions that work for everyone. All right, we're going to get off the balcony for a little while, and now we're going to jump into the knot, the dreaded knot. And we're going to pull on a thread, the knot in our thinking around terminology. Uh, I have to say, right now in publications, presentations, and even everyday discussions, we use different terms interchangeably. Sensory integration, sensory processing, Ayres sensory integration, sensory-based interventions. And it really begins to blur the lines and confuse even experienced practitioners. In addition, these terms are often framed around deficits rather than describing what they are, and that matters. When we start with a deficit frame or a deficit mindset, we automatically jump into a fix-it solution instead of considering the student's diversity, their strengths, and their context. Um, so as we move forward, we do need to keep a wide lens, stay curious, question how terms are used, and make sure we're thinking inclusively rather than assuming deficits. I find it is always very helpful when somebody is using a term and the definition you may feel that the definition is different than your understanding. Ask people to define what they're talking about. It will help improve the conversation. Next slide. All right, so for the purposes of today's discussion, we're going to use these definitions for two key terms. I have sensory integration listed here as the outcome. It's how the brain organizes and combines sensory information to produce an effective, adaptive response. And then the next term, sensory processing, I have it labeled here as the input. It's how a student notices, responds to, and manages sensory information. These terms often intersect, but they focus on different parts of the process. You will many times see them used together, sensory integration and sensory processing. So for the purposes of today, I split them apart just for ease in looking at and considering the terminology. Um, so when you're focusing on different parts of the process, it does help shape some of your questions when observing a student. You can ask yourself, am I looking at how the student responds to sensory input? That would be sensory processing. Or am I looking at how their brain organizes that input to produce action? That's sensory integration. Next slide. Is there a question or? Okay. Evelyn, you might have unmuted yourself.
Sorry.
That's okay. All right. So here we are. I want to introduce this taxonomy of sensory informed practice. This is not, you won't find this in the literature anywhere. What I tried to do for today's presentation is really looked at different frameworks, different models, different theories, and how they all connect. So for the purposes of today's presentation, I'm calling it a taxonomy of sensory informed practice. And really using this more as a framework to help you apply different lenses, depending on what you notice in the moment when you're working with a student or you're observing a student. What's happening when you observe them, which patterns are emerging, and how that understanding can guide your recommendations. So keep in mind, each section that follows is simplified for today's presentation. Everyone is encouraged to continue exploring and building your understanding of these lenses so they can inform your practice more fully. I'm starting with Don's model of sensory processing, which I'm calling the interaction lens. This lens really focuses on how a student's nervous system meets the world, their sensory thresholds, and how they regulate responses to different inputs. Dunn's model helps us understand how students notice and respond to sensory input in everyday life. It looks at two key things, the neurological thresholds, so how sensitive or responsive a student is to sights, sounds, touch, movement, and other sensory input. Some students notice things very easily, others hardly notice them. And then self-regulation strategies, how the student manages or responds to sensory input. Do they actively seek it, avoid it, or respond in a more passive way? So by combining these two ideas of neurological thresholds and self-regulation strategies, Dunn's model identifies these four patterns of sensory processing that can help us understand why a student responds a certain way in school and how we can support their participation. Next slide. All right, the next lens in this taxonomy comes from Miller and colleagues. They have a sensory integration and processing nosology, which I'm calling the diagnostic lens. And this lens helps us identify that specific knot a student might be experiencing. Is it a modulation issue where they're over or under responsive to sensory input? Is it a discrimination issue, just having difficulty sensing and interpreting input accurately? Or is it a sensory-based motor disorder like dyspraxia affecting their planning and their coordination? That diagnostic lens supports really a deeper understanding of what's happening as the student engages in meaningful activities. So by considering performance patterns, or excuse me, performance skills, patterns, and client factors, practitioners can plan interventions and supports that enhance the student's participation and success in daily occupations. Next slide. All right, now we're going to talk about Ayres sensory integration as an intervention lens. And first, I just want to do a quick clarification around why is Ayres sensory integration, why does it have a registered trademark? So over time, the term sensory integration started appearing in research, practice, and presentations, often meaning very different things. To keep the language clear, Ayres sensory integration has been trademarked, so we know we're referring to a specific intervention approach developed by Jean Ayres. And it has defined principles, training, and expectations for fidelity. Ayres sensory integration is an evidence-based specialized intervention approach designed to support sensory processing, motor planning, and adaptive behavior. Importantly, it typically requires advanced training, careful clinical reasoning, and a structured therapeutic context to be delivered with fidelity. So I do want people to take a moment to look at the Ayres sensory integration process elements. When you look at them individually, you'll notice that many, like providing sensory opportunities, supporting motor control, collaborating with adults, are approaches we already see in school practice. Whether you are Ayres sensory integration certified or have the certificate or not, these are common things that we are doing in practice. These strategies are meaningful in their own right, supporting student engagement, participation, and skill development. What distinguishes Ayres Sensory Integration is that it combines these elements within a structured, fidelity-based intervention model, including specialized evaluation, a therapeutic environment, and trained guided delivery. So understanding Ayres SI in this way helps clarify the difference between everyday sensory informed strategies and a trademarked specialized intervention. Next slide. Any questions so far? Oh, bump it back up. Yep, thank you. All right, I'm going to keep going then. All right, this last one in the taxonomy of sensory informed practice, it's sensory informed interventions. It's what I'm referring to as the support lens. It draws on sensory integration theory to support students' regulation and practice, or excuse me, and praxis in natural school context, but does not claim the Ayres SI brand. The focus is on meeting students where they are and promoting participation and autonomy. So I do have this little caution image there around the term sensory-based interventions. It's very important to understand what that term means. More recently, this term has carried a very negative connotation. It was originally, or this definition was originally created to distinguish research in which interventions treat the child as a passive recipient from approaches in which the child, um, oh, excuse me, in which interventions treat the child as a passive recipient versus approaches in which the child actively participates in noticing, connecting, and regulating themselves. For example, giving a student a weighted blanket without baseline data, or giving or without including them in that notice, connect, regulate process, or without measuring meaningful outcomes. All of these things are very different from best practice and would be considered a disservice. And research certainly reflects this. We know that giving a student a weighted blanket and just walking away, it's not magic and result in change. That's what the term sensory-based interventions means. So understanding this term and what it does and does not mean is important for interpreting the literature accurately and using the term responsibly in our communications. All right, back to the sensory. Oh, nope, sorry. Go back. I'm not done. I want to talk about my little graphic, the bell curve. So as far as sensory informed interventions, I want people to think about the bell curve where most students fall within typical ranges of regulation and sensory processing, but we know that some fall outside of it. And sensory informed practice asks, what does this individual student need right now to engage, learn, and thrive? The student's voice would guide the process, and data would ensure strategies are meaningful and relevant. It's about supporting self-regulation in the real world, not just providing sensory input or a sensory-based intervention. Now you can jump ahead, Rebecca. Thank you so much. All right, so let's jump back to the balcony view where I posed kind of those new possibilities. And one of them was looking at our professional reasoning and how we bring theory, evidence, and knowledge into daily practice. So according to the occupational therapy practice framework, professional reasoning means we use theoretical principles and models, understand how conditions affect participation, and apply evidence about what works to guide our decisions. The theory-only trap. Sometimes we get so wedded to a single theory or model that we try to fit every student into that box. And this can limit creativity and responsiveness. So we have to be cautious about that. There's also the theory-free gap. Other times we focus so much on performance components that we lose sight of articulating our professional value. We risk working in isolation from theory and evidence. So we certainly do not want to do that. And then there's this opportunity of theory combined. And this can be the sweet spot in combining multiple theoretical models to address students' occupational performance needs and being able to defend those decisions thoughtfully and effectively. This approach keeps us flexible, reflective, and accountable in supporting real students in real contexts. So in daily practice, this means thinking critically. Which theories or models inform the student's needs? And how does the evidence guide our strategies? And how do we use both to support meaningful participation and outcomes? All right, next slide. So there is this 6-step process to be able to combine multiple models. Following these steps hopefully doesn't feel overwhelming. I just want everybody to think of it as a sequence of practical steps we can apply in everyday practice. So the first one is identify cues. This is during your observational stage. You're going to start by asking, what is happening? And that's when you're collecting your raw data, what you see, what you hear, notice about the student in context. Step 2 is recognizing patterns, being able to connect the dots. How do your observations or the data that you're gathering during your observations fit together? This is where you're beginning to form a hypothesis about what's influencing the student's performance. From there, you can choose an organizing theoretical model to be able to use as the main lens. You're going to pick the primary perspective that will guide your approach. The main lens can be used to really help with your reasoning. Step 4 is set a participation focus, the goal. So what does participation look like? You're going to define what it looks like. Write a clear participation-based goal to anchor your plan. What do you want to see from the student and know that they are successful? Step 5, choose a complementary model. These are your tools. So identifying specific strategies needed to overcome barriers. Add models that really complement your main lens and address specific challenges. On the next slide, we're going to be going through an example. So hopefully this will all come together for everyone. But the last step is once you pull all of this together, make some changes within the student's program. You're going to make dynamic adjustments. This is your opportunity to pivot. You're checking, is everything working? You're observing outcomes, you're adjusting strategies, and if needed, you're going to bring in a new complementary model. We all know that professional reasoning is dynamic. So by following these steps, we can integrate multiple models thoughtfully, keeping our focus on meaningful participation and real student outcomes. There are so many theories, models, and frameworks that we can draw upon in OT practice. So it's just important to be able to engage in professional reasoning in this style. Next slide. All right, I promised you that we would go through a real example. So for this particular one, this is a fifth grader learning to manage their locker. If you've worked with any students preparing to go to middle school or in middle school, managing their locker is a big deal. So this particular student, the occupational therapy practitioner, is observing the student while they're managing the locker. And you're noticing what is happening. You're gathering that data. We notice they drop their books. They look frustrated when the bell rings, and their locker is an absolute mess. Step two, we're taking that data and trying to recognize patterns. What is happening? What do we suspect? It's not just disorganization, but they seem very overwhelmed by noise. They haven't yet built a routine. We observe and note strategies that seem to help what's working for the student in the moment. And we're also checking in with the student to get their perspective. For example, we might say, I noticed X, Y, and Z. Can you tell me what you were feeling? This helps us understand patterns in context and guides the supports we plan. Step three. All right, now you're taking that, you're going to try to figure out what organizing theoretical model you're going to use. So in this particular instance, we're using the model of human occupation because it does include roles and habits and routines as part of that framework or that model. So it seems to really fit to be able to focus on the students' habits and support their role as an independent fifth grader. Step four, we're going to set a participation goal. A reasonable goal is that the student will get their materials and make it to class on time. Very simple. Step five, this is where we get to become a little creative and add some complementary tools. So considering this was a student that seemed to be overwhelmed by noise and maybe the chaos around them, using sensory integration theory to guide our thinking, we can begin to collaborate with the student to explore and trial strategies that support self-regulation and help them feel ready to engage. And then step six, making dynamic adjustments. If the data shows they're still struggling, this is where we can pivot. Maybe we bring in a goal, plan, do, check, or another strategy to refine support, all while collaborating with the student. So by moving step by step, we can combine models thoughtfully, keep the student at the center, and focus on meaningful participation. So we begin to bring that sensory informed lens into our professional reasoning. The reality is that in professional reasoning, like I said, we have a wide range of theories, models, and frames of reference at our disposal. Combining them thoughtfully really allows us to meet students where they are, support meaningful participation, and make our interventions both flexible and powerful. And while this is an example of a fifth grade student, we could certainly adjust our questions, starting at another grade, asking the student, that looked hard. How did it feel to you? Maybe during morning arrival or going to the rug for morning activity, engaging the child to get their input and kind of running through this professional reasoning process. Next slide. So as practitioners weigh or consider implementing Ayres sensory integration intervention in schools, I feel it's critical to point out some realities. And I will confess to everybody, this is where I'm putting on my administrator hat. Um, Spaces, um, sensory gyms, and strategies always sound great in theory, but in practice, they are real challenges, and we need to consider those challenges: space, tools, staff, and time. Without careful planning, even well-intentioned sensory gyms can sit underused, become inefficient, or fail to meaningfully support students. Um, so that is all there for people to think about. I know when people have come to me looking for creating spaces or therapeutic spaces in schools, these are the things I look at. The real estate dilemma. You're competing with other services for space. And if you were an itinerant therapist traveling around, that specialized room could sit empty a large portion of the day. So um, think about the needs and what you're asking for. Tools, capital versus consumable. Some equipment is very pricey. How does it reduce the cost of out-of-district placements or behavioral incidents? If you have the data to support that, maybe funding can go towards it. I don't think we are there at this point. Staff training versus implementation. Does the staff have the buy-in to use the equipment properly, or will it become a glorified playroom? And then time, that schedule crunch. How many students can use the gym at once? If it's one-to-one, the cost per student is high. Sorry. If it's designed for small groups, the efficiency goes up. All of those things. And then do you have time within your day to set up and clean? These are the realities of having a space like this. So I'm just putting it out there for people to think about. Next slide. All right, systems and law. So no matter what intervention model we use, we are bound by federal laws that ensure all students have access to education and support. Yet in practice, schools don't always get it right. And that's where we can step in as informed advocates and collaborators, really helping systems meet their obligations and improve outcomes for all students. Under ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, this focuses on equity and achievement for all students. And we must ask, are we finding opportunities to bring our expertise forward to support all students, not just some? Are people aware of some of the data that schools collect? State school improvement plans and accountability systems can help track whether schools are meeting these goals, and we can be part of that improvement. So it's important to be aware of those pieces. Section 504 focuses on civil rights and non-discrimination, ensuring equal access. So are we actively removing physical or sensory barriers so students can fully participate? And people can monitor compliance metrics around 504 and help ensure that we are supporting access and serving as allies in making that happen. IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, focuses in on individualized, specialized instruction. So are we providing a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment? And people should be aware that states do need to report data up to the United States Department of Ed. So there is Part B data and systems level reporting that shows where gaps exist, and we can help close them. So I always find it very helpful to look at the big picture data and see how we are supporting schools achieve their data targets. Just a quick thing, school practice is unique because we are in the very spaces where students need to participate and perform. We have a direct, meaningful opportunity to make that happen. These laws, are not optional. They guide our decisions and remind us that student-centered, evidence-informed practice must be legally and ethically grounded. Next page. So our strength isn't in a single approach, but in how we bring multiple approaches together. When we are unified, we become unstoppable for our students. As team members in school practice, we can use so many collaborative strategies available to make a real difference in participation, learning, and outcomes. Next one. So parting reflections. We all need to step back and identify the bias. So here's a question to reflect upon. When I hear a colleague suggest an approach that differs from my preferred model, do I feel the need to correct them or to understand them first? The next one is acknowledge the value in the other. The reflective question is, if I were to argue for the opposing perspective for 5 minutes, what valid concern would I actually be addressing? These reflections hopefully remind us that collaboration starts with curiosity, humility, and respect, and that every perspective can teach us something about supporting students better. Next slide. All right, 2 more parting reflections. The safety assessment. So think about your practice. Am I choosing this intervention because it's what I'm most comfortable defending, or because it's truly the best dynamic adjustment for the student's current need? And then the collaborative opening. What's one question I can ask a colleague tomorrow that validates their expertise while inviting them to see mine? So balancing these prompts hopefully help us stay student-centered and curious, balancing our professional judgment with collaboration. And that's all I got, Rebecca. So we can open it up to questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Joyce. Any questions? I know there are some comments in the chat. I don't know if you saw them.
I did not.
Okay. Amy said just to thank you for was working on this very issue of sensory spaces in that school. Heather said, when implementing a sensory diet into the classroom, what is the best approach to educate para and teacher in a multiple disabilities classroom?
Oh, these are good. So I do want to talk about the sensory spaces first, because we've had a lot of conversations here in Connecticut through our community of practice around sensory spaces. It feels as though spaces are created in schools with the notion that these will become spaces for students to regulate, reset, return back to the classroom. But there are so many different pieces that must be in place for that to take place. I'm going to use the term fidelity, and I'm not using it from the perspective of an Ayres SI fidelity, but but we do have to be mindful of making sure that so many pieces are in place um, before we create a sensory space in the schools. Personally, I feel like sensory spaces or rooms in a building actually become isolation rooms. That's that's my perspective. Being in the classroom and Heather, I love that you brought in the sensory diet in the classroom. There are so many great approaches. I know there's a therapist in Massachusetts that has actually engaged students in the classroom and creating, I don't know if it's a sensory corner or sensory spaces, but they really talked about being able to notice how you feel, kind of all of those things, being able to connect and build an understanding of, what works for one person may not work for another person, and um, you know, trying to create sensory strategies that work in a classroom by bringing in students' voice and input into it. It's just so critical to do that. So often we might create a sensory corner or peace corner in the classroom, but if you don't have students involved, then they don't understand how to use it and really have that positive feedback loop so that it's an effective use of the space. Um,
Christina added that we as practitioners understand this, but getting administrators to understand it and not move forward without it is the challenge. And then Eleanor mentioned that they're following a few OT social media, threads where practitioners are discussing how teachers label all student behavior as sensory, the need for
yes.
sensory diet, without actually understanding the complexity of determining multiple factors of behavior. And then
Yep.
these practitioners are frustrated by this and don't really know how to educate and collaborate with teachers.
Yeah. The term sensory is thrown around a lot. And, that gets back to the terminology and, having a heart-to-heart conversation about when you say sensory, what are you talking about? Even using your own professional reasoning and bring theory in to guide that discussion is hopefully will bring your value. Um, yeah, it's a tough one, guys. I know in Connecticut, we actually put together the essentials for a sensory room. So we actually have a document that lists all of that. So sometimes having documents like that you might get together with some of your peers and create, drawing upon the research and literature, can be a helpful handout to give to administrators and start the conversation. Um, yeah.
Well, thank
And
you, Dr. Rioux, for sharing your expertise as always. And for questions, please use the contact information that was provided, and feel free to connect with anyone on social media as well. So we really appreciate you joining us tonight. The recording, slides, and your CEUs will be emailed to you next week. We're going to transition now to a closed PLC, a professional learning community, for the OSEP grant recipients and mentors and mentees. So remember, everyone, part of that there's a separate Zoom link. Um, well, thank you again, and we look forward to seeing everybody in future events. Joyce, I don't know if you see the chat, but everyone is saying thank you. This topic was great,
thank you.
as we all know. I think we're all hungry for this conversation, and you just fed
Yeah,
us well. So thank you.
thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone, and have a wonderful night.